The war had lasted so long that nobody alive on either side could remember how it began. It was simply a fact of life, like the rising of a sun or the falling of rain. Children on both sides were born into it, grew old in it, and died in it. Historians on the human side called it the Long War. The Kael'thari, the alien people who had fought humanity across 100 star systems, called it the Endless Cycle. Both names meant the same thing. Neither side believed it would ever truly end. For 100 years, human and Kael'thari fleets had clashed across the dark between the stars. Entire worlds had been burned to ash. Moons had been shattered into rings of rubble. Whole bloodlines, on both sides, had been wiped from existence in single afternoons of fire. The war had eaten so much that both sides had almost forgotten why they were fighting. There were old treaties, older grudges, ancient massacres that neither side would forgive. But by now, the war fed itself. It did not need a reason anymore. It only needed ships, soldiers, and the will to keep pulling triggers. The Kael'thari were not human in any sense. They were tall, angular beings, with plated gray skin, 4 eyes set into a narrow skull, and long fingers tipped with hard claws. They lived in strict castes, ruled by an emperor whose word was absolute law across 1,000 worlds. Their capital, Kael'mor, sat at the heart of their empire, a planet ringed by shipyards and defense platforms so thick that no human fleet had ever come within 10 light-years of it. It was said, on both sides, that Kael'mor was untouchable. It was the safest place in the galaxy, precisely because it was the most heavily defended place in the galaxy. That belief died on a quiet morning, ship time, when the sky above Kael'mor tore open. There was no warning. No sensor ping. No gravity distortion. No signal intercepted by the listening posts that ringed the system like a spider's web. One moment the sky over the capital city of Vorn-Kaith was clear and pale gold, the color it always was under the light of the system's dying star. The next moment, a single ship was simply there, hanging in low orbit above the palace towers, as if it had always been there, and everyone had simply failed to notice it until now. It was not large by the standards of a war fleet. It was a single vessel, black as a starless night, with a hull that seemed to swallow the light around it rather than reflect it. No visible weapons ports, no visible engines. It made no sound, gave off no heat signature that any sensor could read, and did not respond to any of the frantic hails sent up from the surface in the first 90 seconds after its appearance. Emperor Zorthak Vel Kalith, ruler of the Kael'thari Empire, was in the middle of his morning council session when the alarms began. He was an old being by Kael'thari standards, his gray plating gone pale and cracked with age, his 4 eyes clouded but still sharp. He had ruled through 60 years of the war. He had buried 2 heirs to human weapons. He had ordered the deaths of more humans than any being alive could count. When the alarms sounded, he did not panic. He had heard alarms before. He assumed, as anyone would, that it was another raid, another skirmish at the edge of some border system. Nothing that concerned the safety of the capital itself. Then General Threx Volkarn, commander of the Kael'mor Home Fleet, burst into the council chamber without waiting to be announced. That alone told everyone in the room that something had gone deeply wrong, because Threx was a being of rigid discipline, who had never once broken protocol in 40 years of service. "Emperor," Threx said, his voice tight and controlled in the way that meant he was fighting to keep it that way. "There is a human ship in orbit above the palace." The room went silent. Council members who had spent decades arguing over trade routes and troop deployments simply stared at him, waiting for the joke, the mistake, the correction. It did not come. "That is not possible," said Councillor Vess, an old and cautious being who handled the Empire's intelligence networks. "Our defense grid would have destroyed anything that entered the system before it reached low orbit. The grid has never failed, not once, in 300 years. "The grid did not fail," Threx said. "The grid never engaged. Our sensors never detected an incoming object. The ship is simply there. It appeared without transition, without a warp signature, without anything our instruments can explain." Emperor Zorthak rose slowly from his seat. 60 years of war had taught him to be afraid of very few things. He was afraid now. "Show me," he said. The image that came up on the chamber's main display showed the ship hanging above the capital, dark and utterly still. It was smaller than a single one of the Kael'thari Empire's battleships, dwarfed by the shipyards and defense platforms that studded the space around Kael'mor like a crown of thorns. And yet every gun on every platform, every cannon on every warship in orbit, was aimed at that single vessel, and none of them had fired. "Why have our forces not engaged?" Zorthak asked. "They have tried," Threx said quietly. "Emperor, I ordered 3 separate strikes in the last 2 minutes. Direct plasma fire from the Vorlath platform, a missile spread from the battleship Corvakel, a close-range energy lance from our nearest cruiser. None of it touched the ship. The weapons fire simply stops a short distance from the hull. It does not detonate. It does not deflect. It simply ceases to exist, as if it were never fired at all." No one spoke. On the display, the black ship continued to hang in the sky, patient and silent, like a held breath. "Communications?" Zorthak asked. "Nothing yet," Threx said. "We have sent every standard hailing frequency, every diplomatic channel we still keep open from the old ceasefire attempts decades ago. There has been no response." The Emperor stared at the screen for a long moment, 4 clouded eyes fixed on the impossible shape hovering above his own palace. In 60 years of war, he had learned to read the shape of a threat, to understand what an enemy wanted from the way they positioned their forces, the timing of their strikes, the targets they chose. This made no sense by any of those rules. A single ship, undetected until it was already in place, immune to every weapon turned against it, and making no move to attack. "If they wanted us dead," Zorthak said slowly, "we would already be dead." No one answered him, because no one could argue with that logic, and no one wanted to. 300 light-years away, aboard the human ship in question, the mood was very different, though no less tense. The vessel was called the UNS Requiem, and it was, by any measure that mattered, the strangest ship humanity had ever built. It had no official designation in the standard fleet registry. It did not appear on any public roster. Fewer than 200 people in the entire human government knew it existed, and fewer than 50 knew what it was actually capable of. It had been built in secret, over 11 years, in a shipyard hidden inside the ice of a dead moon that no star chart acknowledged. It was, in the plainest words anyone could use, a machine built to end the war, one way or another. Its captain was a woman named Elena Voss, 44 years old, with gray already threading through her dark hair, and a face that had not smiled easily in a very long time. She had lost her younger brother in the war, 22 years ago, in a battle that had accomplished nothing except adding his name to a memorial wall that already had too many names on it. She had spent the following 2 decades of her life inside the military, rising through ranks that existed mostly on paper, until she had been given command of a ship that, on paper, did not exist at all. She stood now on the bridge of the Requiem, watching the same feed the Kael'thari Emperor was watching, 300 light-years and a wall of shielding away. The alien capital spread beneath them, its towers catching the pale gold light of its dying sun, its shipyards and defense platforms bristling like the quills of some enormous, frightened animal. "They're still firing," said Lieutenant Commander Reyes, at the tactical station, his voice flat with the particular calm of a man determined not to show fear. "Nothing's getting through, Captain. Not even a scratch on the hull sensors." "Good," Elena said. "Keep it that way. No return fire. Not one shot, no matter what they throw at us." "Understood." Reyes hesitated, then added, "Captain, permission to ask a stupid question." "Go ahead." "Are we sure this is going to work?" Elena looked at the screen a moment longer before answering. 11 years of design, testing, and secrecy had gone into this ship. She had personally reviewed every specification, every simulation, every worst-case scenario the engineers could dream up. She had told herself, over and over, that this was the only path left that did not end in one side or the other being wiped out entirely. But standing here now, looking down at a planet full of beings who had every reason in the galaxy to hate her people, she felt the old fear rise up in her chest anyway. "No," she said honestly, "we're not sure of anything, but it's better than the alternative." The alternative, and everyone on the bridge understood this without needing it explained, was another 100 years of the same, another 100 years of burned worlds and broken bloodlines, until one side or the other simply ran out of people to put into ships. Humanity's own scientists had run the numbers, quietly, in classified reports that only a handful of admirals had ever seen. At the current rate of losses, humanity had perhaps 30 more years before its population could no longer sustain the war effort. The Kael'thari, with their stricter breeding laws and more centralized industry, might last a little longer, but not by much. Both sides were burning through their futures to keep fighting a war that neither could remember starting. The Requiem had been built to break that cycle, not through greater firepower, but through something else entirely. Its true purpose was not written into its official specifications, because officially, the specifications did not exist. Only Elena, her senior officers, and a small circle of scientists and politicians back on Earth knew what the ship actually carried in its hold, and why it had been sent, alone and unescorted, into the most heavily defended system in known space. "Signal from the surface," said the communications officer, a young man named Chen, who had barely finished his training before being assigned to this ship. It's the Emperor's personal channel, Captain. They want to talk." Elena felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly. Talk was better than fire. Talk meant there was still a chance. "Put it through," she said, "and Chen, record everything, every word. This is going into the history books, one way or another." The image that resolved on the main view screen was grainy, translated through decades-old diplomatic protocols that had not been used in living memory. It showed an old Kael'thari, gray plating pale with age, 4 clouded eyes fixed on the camera, with an intensity that needed no translation. "I am Emperor Zorthak Vel Kalith," the voice said, rendered into flat, careful English by the ship's translation systems. "You stand above my capital, unharmed by every weapon I possess. I would know who you are, and why you have come, before I decide whether that mercy continues." Elena straightened her uniform, though the alien on the screen could not have cared less about human formality, and stepped forward so the camera could see her clearly. "My name is Elena Voss," she said, "captain of the human vessel Requiem. I am here on behalf of the government of Earth, and I have come to end this war." There was a long silence on the other end of the channel. Then Zorthak spoke again, and his voice, even flattened by translation, carried a weight that filled the entire bridge. "There have been 11 previous attempts to end this war," he said. "Every one of them ended in more death than the war itself might have caused, in the same span of time. Why should I believe this attempt will be any different?" Elena had rehearsed this moment for months, in briefings and simulations and sleepless nights aboard a ship that had taken 11 years to build. But standing here now, with the fate of 2 civilizations balanced on the next words out of her mouth, all of that preparation felt suddenly very small. "Because this time," she said, "we are not asking you to surrender. We are not asking you to accept our terms, or agree to a treaty, or trust a piece of paper signed by people who have every reason to lie to you. We have brought you something else instead. Proof, the truth about how this war began, and why it has never been able to end. Once you have seen it, Emperor, I do not think you will want to keep fighting, and I do not think we will either." Another long silence. On the surface, in the war-scarred council chamber beneath the palace towers, Zorthak stared at the screen, at the human woman who had appeared above his world, in a ship his entire defense grid could not touch, and felt something he had not felt in 60 years of war. He felt curious. Not afraid, not angry, not resigned. Curious. It was a strange and dangerous feeling for a being who had ruled through 6 decades of bloodshed, and he was not sure yet whether to trust it. "Proof," he repeated slowly. "You claim to know why this war began. I claim more than that," Elena said. "I claim to know why it has never ended, despite 11 attempts at peace, despite generations of losses on both sides that should have exhausted any reason to keep fighting. And I believe, Emperor, that once you understand that reason, you will agree with me that it has always been a lie." Zorthak's 4 eyes narrowed, the closest thing his species had to a frown. Around him, his council members shifted uneasily, some of them clearly wanting to order an evacuation, others clearly wanting to hear more. The old Emperor raised a clawed hand, and the room fell silent again. "You will come to the surface," he said finally, "alone, unarmed, under my personal guarantee of safety. If what you say is true, I will hear it. If it is a trick, understand that no guarantee I offer will save you from what follows." On the bridge of the Requiem, Elena felt the eyes of her entire crew on her. Reyes looked like he wanted to argue. Chen looked pale. She understood their fear. She had known, from the very first day this mission had been proposed to her, that stepping onto Kelthari soil alone might well be the last thing she ever did. But she also knew, better than anyone else in the fleet, exactly what evidence the Requiem carried in its hold, and exactly what it would mean once the Kelthari Emperor saw it with his own eyes. She had seen the same evidence herself, months ago, in a secure briefing room on Earth, and it had changed everything she believed about the war she had spent her entire adult life fighting. "I accept," she said. The channel closed. On the bridge, silence stretched out, heavy and uncertain. Outside the viewport, the black ship hung above the golden light of an alien capital, and somewhere far below, an old emperor sat in his council chamber and wondered, for the first time in 60 years, whether the war he had inherited might actually have an end after all. Neither side yet understood how much the next few hours would change everything. Neither side understood that the truth Elena carried with her would not simply end the war. It would force both civilizations to look back across 100 years of grief and ask a question, far more painful than any battle had ever been. What if none of it had ever needed to happen at all? That question was waiting for them, down on the surface of Kael'mor, in a truth that had been buried for a century by people on both sides who had profited from the fighting continuing. Elena did not know yet exactly how the Emperor would react when he learned it. She only knew that she had come too far and lost too much to turn back now. She gathered herself, checked the small case of data crystals that held the evidence her government had spent years compiling, and walked toward the shuttle bay, ready to become the single most hated, or the single most remembered, human being in the history of the war. Reyes caught up with her before she reached the airlock, his footsteps echoing down the narrow corridor. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of officer who had built his whole career on being reliable rather than clever. He did not usually question orders, and that was exactly why Elena stopped to listen when he did. "Captain, this is madness," he said, keeping his voice low so the rest of the crew filing past would not hear. "You walk down there alone, and if this Zorthak decides he doesn't like what you're carrying, that's it. No fleet, no rescue, no second chances. We lose the mission, we lose you, and this ship becomes a legend nobody can explain." "I know," Elena said. "Then let me come with you. Or send someone else. Anyone but the captain." "That's exactly why it has to be me," she said. "If I send a junior officer down there, it tells them this doesn't matter enough to risk our best. If I send you, it tells them we don't trust our own evidence enough to have our own commander stand behind it. I have to go. It's the only way this works." Reyes did not look satisfied, but he had served long enough under Elena to recognize when a decision had already been made 3 times over, in 3 different briefing rooms, long before either of them had set foot on this ship. He stepped back and gave her the sharp, formal salute he usually reserved for admirals, not captains. "Good luck, Captain," he said. "Bring it home." The shuttle that carried Elena down to the surface was small, unarmed, and painted a plain, matte gray that carried no markings of any kind. It had been built specifically for this mission, stripped of every weapon system that might have been mistaken for a threat. Its hull fitted instead with sensors that recorded everything, in case this became the last transmission humanity ever received from its most important ambassador. She sat alone in the cramped passenger compartment as the shuttle detached from the Requiem and began its slow, deliberate descent through Kael'mor's pale gold atmosphere. Below her, the alien capital spread out in concentric rings of architecture she had only ever seen in intelligence photographs, tall spires of dark stone rising from a city built along strict, ancient lines, every street and plaza arranged according to a caste system that had governed Kelthari society for longer than humanity had possessed written language. She thought, as the shuttle descended, of her brother, 22 years old when he died, barely out of training, killed in a border skirmish that neither side had bothered to name because there had already been so many like it. She had received the notification while off duty on a supply run, a cold, formal message on a datapad, and she had not cried until 3 days later, alone in her bunk, when the reality of it had finally caught up with the numbness. She had carried that grief through 22 years of service since, through promotions and losses and the slow grinding weight of a war that never seemed to end. She had told herself, more times than she could count, that if she ever found a way to make sure no other sister anywhere, ever received a message like that again, she would take it, whatever the cost. Now she was about to find out whether that promise would cost her everything. The shuttle set down in a wide open courtyard, just outside the palace gates, ringed by Kael'thari soldiers in dark ceremonial armor, their weapons lowered, but their four-eyed gazes fixed on the strange gray craft with open suspicion. Elena took a slow breath, gathered the small case containing the data crystals, and stepped out into the pale gold light of an alien sun, onto the soil of a world that had spent a century trying to destroy everything she had ever known. No one moved for a long moment. The soldiers stared. Elena stood still, hands visible, the case held loosely at her side, exactly as she had been instructed. Then, from the palace gates, a tall figure emerged, draped in the deep crimson robes of Kael'thari nobility, four clouded eyes fixed directly on her. It was Emperor Zorthak himself, come to meet her in person, without guards standing between them, without the safety of a screen or a translated channel. Whatever else happened next, Elena understood in that moment that the old emperor had chosen, against every instinct of 60 years of war, to look his enemy in the eye before deciding what to do with her. "Captain Voss," he said, his voice low and rough, even through the small translation device clipped to his robes. "You have more courage than sense, coming here alone." "Maybe," Elena said, "or maybe I just believe what I'm carrying is worth the risk." Zorthak studied her for a long moment, his ancient, clouded eyes moving over her face, as though searching for something he could not quite name. Then he turned, robes sweeping across the stone courtyard, and gestured for her to follow. "Then let us see," he said, "exactly what a human considers worth ending a war for." Elena followed him through the gates, into the heart of the Kael'thari capital, carrying with her the truth that would either end 100 years of bloodshed, or bring the full weight of an empire's fury down upon her head. Behind her, high above the golden towers of Kael'mor, the black shape of the Requiem waited in silent orbit, its crew watching and waiting for a signal that might never come. The palace of Kael'mor had been built over 3,000 years, added to by generation after generation of emperors, each one leaving behind towers and halls meant to outlast their own reign. Elena Voss walked through corridors of dark polished stone, past murals depicting battles she did not recognize, and portraits of rulers whose names meant nothing to her, and felt, for the first time in her military career, like a very small and very fragile thing. Zorthak walked ahead of her, his crimson robes trailing across the stone floor, flanked now by a full guard of soldiers who watched her with open hostility. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft click of Elena's boots and the heavier tread of Kael'thari feet, echoing down halls that had seen 100 years of war planned and ordered from within their walls. They arrived at a chamber Elena had not expected. It was not the grand council room she had seen through the ship's channel earlier. This was smaller, quieter, lined with shelves of physical records, the kind of room used for private matters rather than public decrees. Zorthak dismissed his guards with a wave of one clawed hand, and though several of them clearly wanted to argue, none of them did. "Now," Zorthak said, once the heavy doors had closed and only the two of them remained. "We are alone, Captain Voss. No audience, no witnesses, nothing for either of us to perform for. Show me this truth you claim is worth a war's ending." Elena set the small case down on a low stone table between them, and opened it. Inside, nestled in dark foam padding, sat a handful of data crystals, each one no larger than a fingertip, each one containing more than a decade of buried history. 100 years ago, she said, before the war began, humanity and the Kael'thari Empire had never met, not once. Your worlds and our worlds were separated by more distance than either side could easily cross. The war did not start because our two peoples met and immediately hated each other. It started because someone wanted it to. Zorthak's four eyes narrowed. That is not the history I was raised on. The Kael'thari Empire was attacked without warning by human raiders at the colony of Threnvos. That attack began the war. Every record my people possess confirms this. "I know," Elena said. "We were taught almost the same thing, in reverse. Every child on Earth grows up learning that Kael'thari warships attacked a human research outpost on the edge of our territory, killing everyone aboard, and that the war began in retaliation. Both of us were taught a lie, Emperor. The same lie, wearing two different faces. She reached into the case and lifted one of the data crystals, holding it up so the pale light from the chamber's high windows caught its edges. This crystal contains recovered records from a research station called Kestrel Point, on the edge of what was then neutral space between our two territories, 103 years ago. The station was run jointly, in secret, by a group that called itself the Continuity. They were not military, they were not part of any government on either side. They were scientists, industrialists, a handful of political leaders from both human and Kelthari worlds, working together towards something they believed was more important than either of our civilizations. What could possibly be more important than the survival of two civilizations? Zorthak asked, his voice edged with disbelief. Profit, Elena said simply, and control. The Continuity had discovered something at Kestrel Point, deep beneath the ice of a moon in that neutral system. A resource neither of our peoples had ever encountered before, something capable of powering technology far beyond anything either side possessed at the time. They called it Ethereum. It was rare, difficult to extract, and worth more than entire star systems, if it could be mined and sold quietly, without either government knowing it existed. Zorthak said nothing, but his claws had curled slightly at his sides, a small, tight motion that Elena recognized, even across the gulf between their species, as the universal sign of someone bracing for bad news. The problem, Elena continued, was that Ethereum could only be extracted safely under conditions of extreme secrecy and enormous, sustained investment. The Continuity needed decades to build the infrastructure required, and they needed both human and Kelthari governments distracted, spending their resources elsewhere, so that neither side would ever look closely enough at that neutral system to notice what was happening beneath the ice of Kestrel Point. They started the war, Zorthak said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice like a spreading stain, to distract us, to keep us fighting each other, instead of looking toward that system. Yes, Elena said. The attack on Threnvos was staged. Human ships, yes, but not sanctioned by any government, crewed by mercenaries paid by the Continuity, using weapons and tactics designed to look like an unprovoked strike. The attack on the human research outpost that we were taught started the war, on our side, was staged the same way, using Kelthari-designed weapons smuggled to a different set of mercenaries. Both attacks happened within days of each other. Both were blamed entirely on the other side, and both governments, furious and grieving, went to war within the month, exactly as the Continuity had planned. Zorthak was silent for a long moment, staring down at the data crystal in Elena's hand, as though it were a living thing that might strike him. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier authority, replaced by something rawer and more uncertain. You are telling me, he said, that 100 years of war, the deaths of billions across 1,000 worlds, the destruction of entire bloodlines on both sides, happened because a group of profiteers wanted us too busy fighting to notice what they were doing. Yes, Elena said quietly, that is exactly what I am telling you. And this Continuity, Zorthak said, what became of them? If this is true, if such an organization existed, why has this never come to light before now, in 100 years of war? Elena set the data crystal down and reached for a second one, her fingers steady, despite the tension coiling through her chest. Because they were very good at what they did, she said. They embedded people inside both of our governments. Advisors, generals, industrialists who profited from weapons manufacturing, politicians who built entire careers on being seen as strong on the war. Every time either side got close to peace, in the 11 attempts before this one, the Continuity's people made certain those attempts failed, sometimes through sabotage, sometimes through assassination, made to look like the other side's doing, sometimes simply through relentless political pressure, convincing entire populations that peace was weakness, that only total victory could ever be acceptable. And Kestrel Point? Zorthak asked. This resource, is it still being extracted? It was, Elena said, for 91 years. The Continuity built an entire hidden industry around Ethereum, selling refined stockpiles quietly to whoever could pay, funding both sides of the war, without either side ever knowing the money, for half their war effort came from the very people profiting off its continuation. It was only discovered 9 years ago, by accident, when a human deep space survey team stumbled across an encrypted supply route that should not have existed. She held up the second data crystal. This contains full survey and financial records recovered from that discovery. Shipping manifests. Encrypted communications between continuity members on both sides. Names, Emperor. Names of Kelthari nobles who sat on your own council, who profited from every year this war continued, who worked, deliberately, to make sure it never ended. And matching names on our side. Generals, senators, corporate leaders, all of them growing wealthier, with every year the fighting dragged on. Zorthak's clouded eyes had gone very still, fixed on the small crystal in Elena's hand, as though he could see the names themselves simply by staring hard enough. You understand, he said slowly, what you are asking me to believe, that members of my own council, perhaps people I have trusted for decades, have been complicit in the deaths of my own people, for the sake of profit. I understand exactly what I'm asking, Elena said, because my own government asked the same thing of itself 9 years ago, when this evidence first surfaced. We found 3 sitting senators, 2 retired generals, and the CEO of the largest shipbuilding corporation on Earth, all of them named in those financial records. All of them had spent decades publicly opposing every peace initiative that came before them, while privately profiting from every ship built, every soldier sent to die. What happened to them? They were arrested, Elena said. Tried. Most of them are serving life sentences now. It took years to build the case quietly enough that the rest of the continuities network, the part embedded in your government, never learned we had discovered anything. If they had known, they would have destroyed this evidence, or worse, escalated the war further to bury it under new tragedies, large enough to distract everyone from asking questions. Zorthak lowered himself slowly into a chair near the stone table, his crimson robes pooling around him, the weight of 60 years of war suddenly visible on his ancient frame, in a way it had not been before. 9 years, he said. You have known this for 9 years, and only now have you brought it to me. It took 9 years to be certain, Elena said, to trace every name, confirm every account, make sure the evidence could withstand every challenge your intelligence services would throw at it the moment we revealed it. It took 9 years to build a ship capable of reaching your capital without being destroyed by your defense grid, because we knew that the moment this evidence became public, the surviving members of the continuity embedded in your government would try to silence us, one way or another, before we ever had the chance to speak. We needed to guarantee that this conversation would happen. That is what the Requiem was built for. Zorthak looked up at her, his 4 clouded eyes searching her face with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle beneath her uniform. The ship that no weapon could touch, he said. That was not merely a demonstration of strength. No, Elena said. It was a guarantee. We could not risk being destroyed before this truth ever reached you. Too much was at stake. Too many people have already died for a lie. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the chamber's high windows, the pale gold light of Kael'mor's dying sun slanted across the ancient stone floor, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, an entire city carried on its daily business, unaware that the truth of a century of grief was being laid bare in a small, quiet room at its heart. Show me the names, Zorthak said finally, his voice low and hard. Every one of them. I would know exactly who has sat at my council table, advising me on the deaths of my own people, while lining their own vaults with the profits of that suffering. Elena reached for the 3rd data crystal, the one that contained the full list, and felt the weight of what she was about to unleash settle heavily across her shoulders. She had known, from the moment this mission had been proposed to her, that revealing this truth would not simply end a war. It would tear open old wounds across an entire empire, expose betrayals at the very highest levels of Kelthari society, and force a reckoning that no one, on either side, was fully prepared for. But there was no other way forward. A peace built on continued lies would only last until the next crisis, the next manufactured tragedy, the next carefully engineered massacre, designed to keep both sides distracted and afraid. If this war was ever going to end for good, both civilizations needed to see, clearly and completely, exactly who had profited from their grief, and exactly how deeply that betrayal ran. She placed the crystal into the reader built into the stone table, and watched as the first names began to appear, floating in pale light above the ancient surface, names that Emperor Zorthak Vel Kalith recognized immediately, and that would, within the hour, bring his entire government to the edge of collapse. The first name to appear was Counselor Vess, the very same being who had stood in the council chamber that morning, insisting that the human ship's arrival was impossible, that the defense grid had never failed in 300 years. Zorthak stared at the name for a long moment, his 4 eyes unmoving, his claws pressed flat against the arms of his chair. Vess, he said quietly. He has served on my council for 30 years. He was a junior officer under my father. I trusted him with the location of every listening post we maintain along the border. According to these records, Elena said, Counselor Vess has received payments equivalent to several 100 million credits over the past 22 years, funneled through at least 6 shell corporations registered on neutral worlds. The payments increase sharply every time a peace initiative reaches serious discussion in your council. 6 years ago, when your government came closest to a ceasefire with Earth, Vess personally lobbied 11 other counselors to reject the terms, citing intelligence reports that later turned out to be fabricated. Zorthak's clawed hand tightened around the arm of his chair, hard enough that Elena heard the faint creak of stone beginning to crack beneath his grip. Continue, he said, his voice a low growl now, all trace of the careful, measured ruler stripped away. More names scrolled past in the pale light above the table. A general who had ordered 3 separate offensives that human historians would later describe as strategically pointless. Offensives that had cost tens of thousands of Kelthari lives, while advancing the war not at all, timed precisely to occur whenever peace talks threatened to gain momentum. A shipping magnate whose fleet had, for decades, held an exclusive and deeply lucrative contract, supplying war materials to the front. A contract that would evaporate the instant the fighting stopped. A junior member of the royal family, distant enough from the throne to escape close scrutiny, who had personally overseen the construction of 3 hidden refineries in neutral space. The very refineries that had processed raw Ethereum into a form that could be sold quietly to buyers on both sides of the war. Zorthak read each name in silence, and with each one, something in his ancient posture seemed to bend further, as though the weight of the revelation were a physical thing pressing down upon his shoulders. He had ruled through 60 years of war. He had ordered soldiers into battles he believed necessary, had watched 2 of his own heirs die in service to what he had always believed was the unavoidable defense of his people. To learn now that so much of it, perhaps all of it, had been manufactured and sustained by people he had trusted, people who had sat at his own table and offered him counsel while their private fortunes grew fat on the blood of his empire, was almost more than even a being who had survived a century of grief could bear. How many? He said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. How many names are on this list? 47. On your side, Elena said gently. 63 on ours. Some are dead now, of natural causes or otherwise, having enjoyed the fruits of their betrayal for decades, before passing whatever remained of their fortunes to descendants who may or may not have known where the wealth truly came from. Others are still alive, still in positions of influence, still profiting from every day this war continues. Zorthak rose from his chair with sudden sharp violence, crossing the small chamber in 3 long strides to stand at the tall window overlooking his capital. Below, the towers and plazas of Vorn Kaith stretched out beneath the pale gold sun, full of Kelthari, going about lives built on 100 years of grief they had never chosen and never truly understood. My people have starved to feed the war machine, he said, not turning around. Entire colonies have been abandoned, so their resources could be redirected to the front. I have signed conscription orders that took children barely old enough to hold a weapon and sent them to die on worlds they had never heard of before the orders arrived, and all of it, because a group of thieves wanted us too busy killing each other to notice what they were stealing beneath our feet. Yes, Elena said quietly. There was nothing else to say that would not sound hollow against the scale of what he was grappling with. He turned back to face her, and for the first time since she had stepped off the shuttle, Elena saw something other than wariness in his ancient, clouded eyes. It looked almost like grief, raw and unguarded, the kind of expression a ruler rarely allowed himself to show, least of all in front of an enemy. And your people, he said, when they learned this same truth 9 years ago, how did they respond? Badly at first, Elena admitted. There were riots outside the Senate buildings, When the first arrests were made public, people had lost children, parents, entire families to this war, and to learn that so much of that loss had been manufactured for profit was almost unbearable. Some people refused to believe it at all, insisted it was misinformation, designed to weaken our resolve against the Kael'thari. It took years of careful, transparent investigation, trial after trial conducted in full public view, before most people accepted the truth of what had happened. And once they accepted it, then they wanted the war to end, more than anything else in the galaxy, Elena said, because continuing to fight, once you understand that the fighting itself was manufactured by thieves for profit, feels like the greatest insult imaginable to everyone who has already died. My government spent 9 years quietly investigating, quietly preparing, quietly building the Requiem, specifically so that when this truth finally reached your side, we would already have a plan in place to move immediately toward peace, rather than descending into the same chaos and disbelief we experienced ourselves. Zorthak studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the strange sensation of being measured by a mind far older and more experienced than her own, a ruler who had survived 6 decades of war through careful judgment of exactly this kind. You risked everything, he said slowly, coming here alone, to tell me that my own council has betrayed me for a century. If I had chosen not to believe you, if I had ordered my guards to kill you where you stood, this truth would have died with you, and my empire would have continued exactly as before. I know, Elena said. Why take that risk? Elena thought of her brother, 22 years dead, and of the message that had reached her on a datapad during a routine supply run, cold and formal, and utterly insufficient to the weight of what it announced. She thought of every name on the memorial wall back on Earth, growing longer every year, and of the children being born, even now, into a war that had never needed to happen at all. Because someone had to, she said simply. And because I was tired of losing people to a lie. Zorthak was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had steadied, some of the old authority returning even through the visible weight of his grief. Then we must decide, Captain Voss, what is to be done with this truth, and with the men and women who have profited from a century of blood, and we must decide it quickly, before word of your presence here spreads beyond this room, and those 47 names on my own side realize exactly how much danger they are now in. Outside the chamber, unnoticed by either of them, a single guard stationed just beyond the heavy doors had pressed his ear close enough to catch fragments of the conversation within, fragments that included, among other things, the name of a certain counselor who had, only that morning, quietly promised him a substantial reward for any information regarding the human visitor's true purpose. The guard slipped away down the corridor, moving quickly and quietly toward the private chambers of Counselor Vess, carrying with him the first spark of a crisis that would very nearly undo everything Elena Voss had risked her life to accomplish. The war that had lasted 100 years was about to end. But first, it would have to survive one final, desperate attempt by the very people who had started it, to make sure it never did. Counselor Vess had survived 30 years in Kael'thari politics by learning, early and thoroughly, that survival depended on knowing things before other people did. When the guard reached his private chambers, breathless and speaking in the low, urgent tone of someone who understood he was carrying dangerous knowledge, Vess listened without interrupting, his 4 eyes narrowing further with every word. A human woman, alone in the Emperor's private chamber. Data crystals, names, his own name, spoken aloud by the Emperor himself, in a tone the guard described as something close to fury. Vess did not panic. He had built an entire career on not panicking, on making careful, deliberate decisions while others around him lost their composure. But even his considerable discipline could not entirely smother the cold weight that settled into his chest as the guard finished speaking. 30 years of careful work, 30 years of quiet payments, and manufactured intelligence reports, and patiently sabotaged peace talks, all of it balanced now on the edge of a blade that could fall in either direction within the hour. He dismissed the guard with a curt nod and a promise of further reward, then sat alone in his chambers for a long moment, his claws steepled before him, considering his options with the same cold calculation he had applied to 30 years of political survival. There were, he decided, only 2 paths forward. He could flee, abandon his position, his wealth, his standing, and hoped to disappear into the vast reaches of the Empire before anyone thought to look for him. Or he could act, decisively and immediately, to make certain that whatever evidence the human woman carried never reached beyond the walls of that private chamber. He chose to act. It was, in the end, the only choice a man like Vess had ever truly known how to make. Back in the small stone chamber, Elena and Zorthak had moved on to discussing the delicate mechanics of what would need to happen next, when the process might begin to identify and remove every corrupted official on both sides, when the doors burst open without warning, and 6 armed soldiers flooded into the room, weapons raised, not toward Elena, but toward the Emperor himself. "Counselor Vess sends his regrets, Your Majesty," said the lead soldier, his voice flat and mechanical in the way of someone who had rehearsed the line and did not want to think too hard about what he was doing. "He asks that you understand this is nothing personal, merely business, continuing as it always has." Zorthak did not move. 60 years of war had taught him many things, and chief among them was the value of stillness in the face of a raised weapon. "You would kill your own emperor," he said, "on the word of a counselor who has spent 30 years selling out your empire for profit." "Counselor Vess has been very generous to those of us who understand the value of loyalty," the soldier said, "and very clear about the consequences for those who do not." Elena's hand moved slowly toward the small communicator clipped inside her collar, the one linked directly to the Requiem in orbit above the capital, but the soldier's eyes snapped toward her instantly, his weapon swinging to cover her instead. "Do not," he said. "Whatever signal you are about to send, I promise you it will not save either of you in time." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Zorthak spoke again, his voice carrying the same weight it had carried through 6 decades of rule, undiminished, even with a weapon pointed at his chest. "You are making a mistake," he said. "Not because you threaten me. I have faced death before, and I do not fear it now. You are making a mistake because you believe Vess can protect you from what comes next. He cannot. The human ship above this palace is not the only proof of what he has done. Copies of that evidence exist elsewhere, in places neither Vess nor you will ever find them. Killing me will not erase the truth. It will only add my death to the long list of things Vess has already stolen from this empire." The lead soldier hesitated, just slightly, his weapon wavering for the first time. Elena, watching closely, recognized the moment for what it was. A man who had been promised safety and reward for a simple, contained act of violence, suddenly confronting the possibility that the act would not remain simple or contained at all. "He said this would be quiet," the soldier said, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "A private matter. No one would ever need to know." "Nothing about this will remain quiet," Zorthak said. "Not anymore. The moment you fire that weapon, you become part of the same story as Vess, the same betrayal, the same theft of a century's worth of lives. Is that truly what you want your name remembered for?" It was, in the end, enough hesitation to matter. Elena moved fast, faster than any of the soldiers expected from a human, unfamiliar with their armor and their weapons, closing the distance to the nearest guard, and driving her elbow into the joint of his weapon arm, with the kind of precise, practiced force that came from years of close-quarters training aboard cramped starship corridors. The weapon clattered to the stone floor, and in the half-second of confusion that followed, Zorthak moved too, seizing a heavy ceremonial staff from its mount on the wall and bringing it down hard across the shoulders of the soldier nearest to him. What followed was brief and chaotic. 4 soldiers still armed and dangerous, an aging emperor and a human captain, fighting with whatever came to hand in a chamber never designed for combat. Elena took a glancing blow across her ribs that would leave a deep, ugly bruise for weeks afterward, but managed to wrestle a second weapon free and level it at the remaining soldiers before any of them could recover their composure. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the pain lancing through her side. "Put down your weapons. This ends now, one way or another." The soldiers, faced with an armed human and an emperor who had already proven he would not go quietly, exchanged uncertain glances. Then, one by one, they lowered their weapons to the floor, the fight draining out of them as quickly as it had begun. It was in that moment, as Zorthak moved to summon his loyal guard and secure the chamber, that the true scale of the crisis became clear. Word of the attempted assassination could not be contained. Within minutes, The palace was in an uproar, loyal guards clashing briefly with a small faction of soldiers who had been quietly cultivated by Vess and his allies over years of careful bribery, before the confusion resolved itself in favor of the crown. Vess himself, understanding that his gambit had failed, attempted to flee the capital entirely, commandeering a private transport in a desperate bid to escape before the full weight of imperial justice descended upon him. He did not make it far. Zorthak's personal guard, once mobilized and given clear orders, moved with the ruthless efficiency of soldiers who understood exactly what was at stake. Vess was captured within the hour, dragged back to the palace in restraints, his 30 years of careful, patient betrayal collapsing around him in a single afternoon. Aboard the Requiem, high above the capital, the crew had watched the chaos unfold on the surface with growing alarm, unable to intervene, unable even to confirm whether their captain still lived, since Elena's communicator had gone dark the moment the assassination attempt began. "Captain's not responding," Chen reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Nothing on any channel. Last confirmed contact was 40 minutes ago." Reyes stood at the tactical station, his jaw set, every instinct screaming at him to order an immediate descent, to send every armed shuttle the Requiem carried down to the surface to extract their captain by force if necessary. But he also understood, with the same clarity Elena had tried to explain before she left, that any show of force now, any hint that humanity was prepared to use violence on Kael'thari soil, would undo everything this mission had been built to accomplish. "Hold position," he said finally, the words costing him more effort than any order he had given in his career. "No shuttles, no weapons fire. We wait." It was the longest hour of Reyes's life, standing on that bridge, staring down at a planet that might, at that very moment, be deciding whether to execute his captain, for daring to speak an uncomfortable truth. He thought of Elena's words before she left, about her brother, about promises made in grief, and understood, finally, exactly why she had insisted on going alone. She had not been reckless. She had been certain, in the particular way that only someone who has already lost everything important can be certain, that this was worth whatever price it demanded. The signal, when it finally came, arrived not through the ship's communicator, but through a direct channel opened by the palace itself, a formal diplomatic transmission carrying the seal of the Kael'thari Emperor. "This is Emperor Zorthak Vel Kalith," the voice said, translated into flat, careful English, speaking to the human vessel above my capital. "Your captain lives. She is unharmed, save for injuries sustained, defending my life against traitors within my own government. I would ask that you continue to hold your position, and your restraint, for a little while longer. There is much still to be done, but the truth your captain brought to my world will not be buried, not this time." On the bridge of the Requiem, a wave of relief swept through the crew, so palpable that several officers had to steady themselves against their consoles. Reyes closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself, finally, the fear he had refused to show his crew for the past hour. "Acknowledged, Your Majesty," he said, once he trusted his voice again. "We'll hold position. And, thank you, for protecting her." "She protected herself, and me alongside her," Zorthak said. "I merely had the good sense to fight beside her, rather than against her. A lesson, perhaps, that both our peoples might have learned a century sooner, had we not been so carefully prevented from ever meeting long enough to learn it." Down in the palace, in a chamber now guarded by soldiers whose loyalty had been tested and proven within the last hour, Elena sat with a medic tending to the deep bruise across her ribs, watching as Zorthak paced the length of the room, his ancient frame carrying the exhaustion of a day that had upended 60 years of certainty in the span of a few brief hours. "Vess will face judgment," he said, more to himself than to her. "As will every name on that list, on my side of this war. I will see to it personally. But this is only the beginning, Captain Voss. 47 names among my own council and command structure, 63 among yours. Entire industries built on the continuation of this war, entire fortunes that will evaporate the moment peace is truly declared. Do you imagine the remaining conspirators, the ones not yet named, the associates and allies of those we have identified, will simply accept this without further resistance?" Elena winced as the medic tightened a bandage around her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "No," she said. "I imagine they'll fight this as hard as they've fought to keep the war going. Maybe harder, now that they know exposure means prison. or worse. But Emperor, we've already survived the first attempt to silence this truth. And every hour that passes now, more people learn what really happened. My government began releasing this same evidence to the human public the moment I departed for your capital. It's already spreading. It can't be contained anymore. Not on our side. And soon, not on yours either. Zorthak stopped his pacing and turned to face her fully, his four clouded eyes fixed on her with an intensity that Elena had come to recognize, in the short hours since they had met, as the particular look of a ruler recalculating everything he thought he understood about the world. Then we must move quickly, he said, to secure whatever peace can be built from these ashes, before the conspirators still at large find some new way to plunge us back into war, rather than face the judgment awaiting them. This will not be simple, Captain Voss. 100 years of grief does not vanish because the lie behind it has been exposed. There will be grieving families on both sides, who will refuse to believe any of this, who will insist their losses meant something, that their children did not die for the profit of thieves. I know, Elena said. My people faced the same grief, 9 years ago, when this truth first came to light for us. It took time. It took patience, and transparency, and a willingness to let people be angry before they could begin to heal. But it happened, Emperor. My people found their way to accepting it, eventually. I believe yours can too. Zorthak was quiet for a long moment, watching her with something that had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from wariness into something closer to respect. You very nearly died today, he said. Twice, if I count the weapons fire against your ship this morning, and the blade that came within a hand's width of your ribs an hour ago. And still you speak of patience, of healing, as though the war that has defined both our civilizations for a century might simply be set aside because the truth has finally surfaced. Not simply, Elena said. Never simply. But possible. That's all I came here to prove, Emperor. Not that peace would be easy, only that it's possible, and that it's worth fighting for, in whatever way that fight needs to take now. Outside the palace walls, word of the assassination attempt and the truth behind it had already begun spreading through the streets of Vornkaith, carried by servants and guards and council aides who had witnessed fragments of the chaos and could not help but share what they had seen. By nightfall, the story would reach every corner of the capital. By the following morning, it would spread across the empire entirely, carried on every communication channel the Kelthari possessed, an unstoppable tide of truth that no conspirator, however wealthy or well-connected, would be able to hold back. 300 light-years away, on Earth, the reaction to the news arriving from Kael'mor was just as chaotic, though it unfolded across screens and city squares rather than palace corridors. The human government had timed the release of its own portion of the evidence to coincide precisely with Elena's arrival at the capital, understanding that the truth would land far harder if both civilizations learned it together, at the same moment, rather than one side hearing it filtered through the other's translation and spin. Across the cities of Earth, people gathered around public screens to watch the grainy, translated footage of Emperor Zorthak's private council chamber leak out through official channels. Footage that showed an alien ruler grappling with the same grief and fury that human families had wrestled with 9 years earlier. There was anger, certainly, old wounds torn open by the confirmation that so much loss had been manufactured rather than earned through any real necessity. But there was something else too, something that surprised even the officials who had spent years preparing for this moment. A strange, cautious relief, the feeling of an old and exhausting weight finally being set down. In a small apartment in what had once been called Chicago, an elderly woman named Marta Reyes, no relation to the lieutenant commander aboard the Requiem, sat in front of her screen, with her hands pressed to her mouth, watching footage of the Kelthari Emperor's grief-stricken voice, translated into words she could understand. She had lost her husband in the war, 30 years ago, in a battle that the official records had always described as a necessary defense against unprovoked Kelthari aggression. She had spent 3 decades believing that his death had meant something, had served some larger purpose in the defense of humanity's survival. Now, watching an alien emperor confess to discovering the same manufactured lie on his own side of the war, she found herself weeping, not entirely from grief, though the grief was certainly there, old and familiar and freshly reopened. She wept, too, from something that felt almost like hope, the strange and unfamiliar sensation of imagining a future in which her grandchildren might never have to receive the kind of message she had received all those years ago. Back on Kael'mor, in the hours following the failed assassination attempt, Zorthak convened what remained of his loyal council, a smaller and more subdued gathering than the one that had greeted the alarms that morning. Councillor Vess sat among them now in restraints, stripped of his ceremonial robes, his 4 eyes fixed on the floor, rather than meeting the gazes of colleagues who had, until that morning, considered him a trusted friend and advisor. "You will stand trial," Zorthak told him, his voice carrying none of the fury that had consumed him in the private chamber earlier, replaced now by something colder and more controlled. "Publicly, before the full council, and whatever portion of the population wishes to witness it. Every payment you received, every peace initiative you sabotaged, every life lost because of your greed, will be laid bare for all to see. You will not be permitted to hide behind quiet influence or careful manipulation ever again." Vess said nothing, his silence perhaps the closest thing to an admission of guilt that 30 years of careful political survival would ever allow him to offer. "Take him to the holding chambers," Zorthak said to the guards flanking him, "and begin the process of identifying every other name on that list still within reach of imperial justice. I want them found, all of them, before they have the chance to flee or destroy evidence of their own." As the guards led Vess away, one of the remaining councillors, an older Kelthari named Threnna, who had served on the council for nearly as long as Zorthak had ruled, spoke up cautiously from her seat near the back of the chamber. "Your Majesty," she said, "if this evidence is accurate, if the war truly began through manufactured deception rather than genuine conflict between our peoples, what becomes of the war itself? Do we simply declare it ended, after a century of losses on both sides? Our military structure, our economy, entire generations of our society have been built around the assumption of continued conflict with the humans. Ending it will not be as simple as signing a document." Zorthak considered her question for a long moment before answering, his gaze drifting toward the window and the pale gold light of the capital beyond it. "No," he agreed, "it will not be simple. But simplicity was never the price we were promised for peace, Counselor. Only that it was possible, and that it was owed to every soul who has died in a war they never should have had to fight. We will find a way forward, difficult as it may be. We owe that much to the dead, on both sides of a line that should never have been drawn in the first place." It was in this same council chamber, hours later, that Elena Voss found herself standing once more, her ribs bound tightly beneath her uniform, addressing a room full of Kelthari nobility, who had spent decades believing her species to be nothing more than a distant, hated enemy. "I know this is difficult to hear," she said, her translated voice carrying clearly through the chamber's high stone walls. "I know that grief does not simply disappear, because its cause has been exposed as a lie. My own people struggled with this same truth 9 years ago, and some of us are struggling with it still. But I promise you this, the alternative, continuing to fight a war that both of our governments now know was manufactured for profit, would be a far greater betrayal of everyone who has already died. We owe them peace now, however difficult that peace may be to build." The chamber remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking, the weight of her words settling over councillors who had spent their entire lives believing in the necessity of a conflict that had, it now seemed, never needed to exist at all. Then, slowly, one councillor after another began to rise from their seats, not in anger, but in something that looked, to Elena's eyes, remarkably like the beginning of acceptance. The war that had lasted 100 years was not yet over. But for the first time since it began, both sides had finally been given the chance to understand exactly why it had never needed to happen at all, and that understanding, once released into the world, could never again be put back into the dark. The days that followed the failed assassination attempt were the strangest of Elena Voss's life. She remained on Kael'mor, under Zorthak's personal protection, while the machinery of 2 civilizations slowly began the painful, complicated work of transitioning from a century of war toward something neither side had any real experience building, a lasting peace. It was not simple, exactly as Zorthak had warned it would not be. The 47 names identified on the Kelthari side did not all surrender quietly. Several fled before they could be captured, escaping into the vast, ungoverned reaches of the Empire's outer colonies, where imperial authority had always been thin and unreliable. 2 others attempted, unsuccessfully, to rally military support for a coup that might restore the war, and, with it, the flow of profit they had grown accustomed to over decades of careful theft. Both attempts collapsed within days, undone by soldiers who had heard the truth and found themselves unwilling to shed more blood in service of a lie they now understood clearly. On Earth, the reckoning played out differently, but with similar difficulty. The 63 names on the human side included figures far more prominent than anyone had faced during the first wave of arrests 9 years earlier. A former president, now retired but still deeply influential, was named among those who had quietly profited from decades of Ethereum sales, while publicly championing the war's continuation in speech after speech. The revelation triggered a political crisis that consumed the news cycles of every human world for weeks, forcing entire governments to reckon with how deeply the conspiracy had embedded itself into the institutions people had trusted for generations. Elena followed these developments through carefully filtered updates relayed to her aboard the Requiem, feeling the strange, dislocated sensation of watching her own civilization's response to a crisis she had personally set in motion, from 300 light-years away, in the company of the very people her nation had spent a century fighting. It was during this period that she came to know Zorthak not merely as an emperor, but as a person, in the particular way that shared crisis often strips away the formal distance between 2 people who might otherwise have remained strangers forever. They spoke often, in the quiet hours between council sessions and diplomatic briefings, about the war, about the losses each had carried, about the strange, unexpected weight of discovering that so much grief had been manufactured rather than earned. "I had 2 heirs," Zorthak told her one evening, as they walked together along a high balcony overlooking the capital, the golden light of sunset stretching long shadows across the ancient stone. "Both died in the war. My eldest fell during the Threxian offensive, 40 years ago, in a battle my generals assured me was strategically vital to securing our southern border. My youngest died 12 years later, in what I was told was a defensive action against an unprovoked human incursion." Elena said nothing, understanding, from long experience with her own grief, that sometimes the kindest thing a listener could offer was simply the space to speak. "I have since learned," Zorthak continued, his voice carefully controlled, "that the Threxian offensive was ordered by a general, now confirmed to be among the 47 names, timed deliberately to occur during a period when peace negotiations had begun showing unusual promise. My eldest child did not die defending our border. She died because a corrupt general needed a distraction large enough to derail talks that threatened his continued profit." "I'm sorry," Elena said quietly. It was an inadequate thing to say, and she knew it, but there was no adequate thing to offer against grief of that magnitude. "As am I," Zorthak said, "for your brother. You have not told me the details, but I have seen enough grief in your eyes these past days to recognize its shape, even across the differences between our species." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink lower over the alien capital. "He was 22, she said finally, barely out of training. He died in a border skirmish, so small, it didn't even have an official name, just a coordinate designation that meant nothing to anyone, except the families who lost someone there. I used to tell myself it meant something, that his death was part of some larger purpose, some necessary sacrifice in defense of humanity's survival. And now? Now I don't know what to tell myself," she admitted. "Except that maybe it's enough that his death, and every death like his, finally led somewhere. Even if that somewhere is just this, just the 2 of us, standing here, trying to figure out how to stop it from happening to anyone else." Zorthak was silent for a long moment, his 4 ancient eyes fixed on the horizon. "My people have a saying," he said finally. "That grief carried alone becomes a stone, heavy and unmoving, dragging down everything it touches. But grief carried together, shared honestly between those who understand its weight, can become instead a bridge, something that connects rather than isolates." "That's a good saying," Elena said. "It is an old one," Zorthak said. "Older than the war, in fact. I had nearly forgotten it, in 60 years of ruling through conflict. It is strange, Captain Voss, how 100 years of fighting can make a species forget wisdom it once considered fundamental to its own culture." Far from the palace, At a forward outpost near the contested border that had marked the front line of the war for the past 15 years, a young Kael'thari soldier named Threxa Volcaris received the news of the Emperor's discovery through a garbled, hastily distributed broadcast that reached the outpost 3 days after the events in the capital. She had been born in the war, raised in it, trained for it since the age of 12 according to the Empire's conscription laws, and had never known a single day of her life that was not shaped, in one way or another, by the ongoing conflict with humanity. She listened to the broadcast in the outpost's cramped common room, alongside a dozen other soldiers who had grown up in circumstances much like her own, and felt something complicated and difficult to name settle into her chest as the details of the continuity's century of manipulation became clear. Her older brother had died 8 years earlier, in a skirmish along this very border, in an engagement the official reports had described as a critical defense against human aggression. She had carried his memory as a source of pride and purpose through every difficult day of her own service since. Now, listening to the broadcast, she learned that the skirmish that had killed her brother had, in fact, been deliberately provoked by a human mercenary unit paid by the very conspirators the Emperor had just exposed, timed specifically to disrupt a minor diplomatic overture that had been quietly gaining traction at the time. Her brother had not died defending the Empire. He had died so that a handful of profiteers could keep their illegal trade routes running undisturbed for a few more years. She did not know, in that moment, whether to feel rage or grief or something else entirely, some combination the Kael'thari language did not have a clean word for. She excused herself from the common room and walked alone to the edge of the outpost, staring out across the scarred, cratered landscape that marked the border between two empires that, she now understood, had never truly needed to be at war at all. It was there that her commanding officer found her an hour later, a grizzled veteran named Korlath who had served on this same border for nearly 30 years. "You heard the broadcast," Korlath said, not really a question. "My brother," Threxa said, her voice tight. "He died for nothing. Worse than nothing. He died so thieves could keep stealing." Korlath was quiet for a long moment, his own ancient eyes fixed on the same scarred horizon. "I lost a mate to this war," he said finally. 31 years ago, in an engagement not far from where we stand now. I have told myself, every day since, that her death meant something, that it served some purpose, larger than the grief it left behind. And now? Now I do not know what to tell myself, Korlath admitted, except that perhaps the only thing left to give her death meaning is to make certain nothing like it ever happens again. That is the only purpose I can still find in any of it. Similar conversations, in similar outposts and cities and quiet family homes, across 1,000 Kael'thari worlds, were unfolding in the days following the broadcast, as an entire civilization began the slow, painful process of reconciling 100 years of accepted history with a truth that upended nearly everything they had believed about the necessity of their sacrifice. It was not a clean process. There was anger, certainly, and denial, and in some cases, outright refusal to accept evidence that contradicted a lifetime of deeply held belief. But there was also, running underneath all of it, a current of something that might eventually become relief, the possibility that the grief so many had carried for so long might finally be allowed to heal, rather than being continually reopened by fresh losses in service of a war that had never needed to be fought. The formal negotiations, when they finally began in earnest, were held not in the grand ceremonial halls that had hosted the 11 previous failed peace attempts, but in a smaller, more practical setting, a converted meeting chamber, where delegates from both Earth and the Kael'thari Empire could sit across from each other at something closer to eye level, without the weight of 100 years of ceremony pressing down on every word spoken. Elena served as the human government's lead representative, a role that surprised her as much as it surprised the rest of the delegation, given that she had never held a formal diplomatic posting before this mission. But her government understood, correctly, that no one else carried the same weight of trust with Zorthak, the same history of having risked everything together in the chaotic hours following the assassination attempt. The negotiations were slow and often difficult. There were disputes over territory, over reparations, over the fate of the remaining conspirators, still at large on both sides. There were moments when old grievances, decades or even a century in the making, threatened to derail the entire process, as delegates on both sides found themselves unable to set aside grief and anger, even in the face of clear evidence that the war itself had been an engineered lie. One of the fiercest disputes centered on the fate of the border colonies, worlds that had changed hands multiple times over the course of the war, fought over and rebuilt and destroyed again, so many times that entire generations of both human and Kelthari settlers had grown up not knowing which government would claim their world by the time they reached adulthood. Kelthari delegates argued that these colonies rightfully belonged under imperial authority, citing centuries-old claims that predated the war entirely. Human delegates countered that the populations of several of these worlds were now majority human, having been resettled during the war's middle decades, and that any transfer of authority needed to account for the wishes of the people actually living there, rather than abstract historical claims from either government. The dispute nearly collapsed the entire negotiation on its third week, when a Kelthari delegate named Vorath, a hardline traditionalist who had lost his own son in a battle over one of the contested colonies, stood up from the table and declared that he would rather see the negotiations fail entirely than surrender ancestral Kelthari territory to human settlers who had only arrived there because of the war's destruction in the first place. It was Zorthak himself who intervened, calling for a recess and speaking privately with Vorath for nearly 2 hours before negotiations resumed. What was said in that private conversation was never fully recorded, but when Vorath returned to the table, he proposed, quietly and without his earlier hostility, a compromise, a system of shared governance for the most contested colonies, with local councils made up of both human and Kelthari representatives, answerable to both governments jointly, rather than to either one exclusively. It was not a perfect solution, and it satisfied no one completely, but it satisfied enough people on both sides to keep the negotiations moving forward, and in the years that followed, several of those shared colonies would become, quietly and without much fanfare, some of the most successful examples of genuine cooperation between the two peoples. On the human side, similar tensions arose over the question of reparations, with some delegates arguing that the Kelthari Empire, having fought the war for a century, owed enormous compensation to human worlds destroyed in the fighting, regardless of the fact that the war itself had been manufactured by conspirators on both sides, rather than a genuine act of Kelthari aggression. Elena found herself, more than once, arguing against members of her own delegation, insisting that a peace built on punishing the Kelthari for a war neither side had actually chosen would only plant the seeds of the next conflict, decades or generations down the line. "We are not here to assign blame to an entire species," she told her own delegation, during a tense closed-door session that nearly fractured the human negotiating team entirely. "We are here to hold accountable the specific individuals who manufactured this war for profit, and to build something better from what remains. If we demand reparations that punish ordinary Kelthari families for the crimes of 110 specific conspirators, we will have learned nothing from what happened to us 9 years ago, when the same anger nearly consumed our own reckoning before the truth had time to properly settle." It was not an easy argument to win, and it cost Elena a measure of political support back on Earth that would follow her for years afterward. But she held her position, and slowly, delegation by delegation, others came to see the wisdom in it. The final framework included accountability measures aimed specifically at the identified conspirators and their assets, rather than broad reparations levied against the Kelthari Empire as a whole, a distinction that would prove critical to the peace's long-term survival in the difficult years that followed. But slowly, painstakingly, progress was made. A framework began to emerge, built not on the total victory either side had once believed was the only acceptable outcome, but on something closer to genuine partnership, shared oversight of the Kestrel Point system and its remaining Ethereum reserves, joint tribunals to try the remaining conspirators wherever they might eventually be captured, and perhaps most significantly, a mutual commitment to full transparency between the two governments going forward, an agreement that no future crisis, however severe, would ever again be allowed to fester in secrecy the way the continuity's century-long deception had. "We cannot promise this will be perfect," Elena told the assembled delegates on the day the framework was finally ready to be signed. "There will be setbacks. There will be people on both sides who never fully accept this peace, who continue to believe the old lies simply because they have believed them for so long that the truth feels like a betrayal in itself. But we can promise this. For the first time in 100 years, our two peoples will move forward, with full knowledge of exactly what brought us to war, and exactly what it will take to keep us from ever falling into the same trap again. Zorthak, seated across from her at the long negotiating table, rose slowly to his feet, his ancient frame carrying the weight of 60 years of rule, and, now, the fresh weight of a peace he had never truly expected to see in his lifetime. "I have ruled through war for 6 decades, he said, his translated voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I buried 2 children, to a conflict I believed was necessary, only to learn it was manufactured by thieves, who profited from every death on both sides. I do not offer this peace lightly, nor do I offer it without reservation, but I offer it, because the alternative, continuing to fight in service of a lie now fully exposed, would dishonor every soul who has already been lost to this war, on both sides of a line that should never have existed in the first place." The signing of the framework, when it finally happened, was a quiet affair, lacking the grandeur that a peace ending a century of war might have been expected to command. There were no parades, no elaborate ceremonies, no declarations of victory, because neither side felt, in their hearts, that victory was the right word for what had been accomplished. Instead, there was simply a document, signed by an emperor and a captain who had, against every expectation either government had held at the start of this mission, come to trust each other across the vast gulf that had once seemed to separate their two peoples entirely. News of the signing reached both civilizations within hours, spreading across 1,000 worlds and dozens of human colonies, met with a complicated mixture of relief, grief, anger, and cautious hope that would take years, perhaps generations, to fully resolve. Not everyone celebrated. There were protests on both sides, from people who had built their entire identities around the war's continuation, who could not, or would not accept that a century of sacrifice had been built on manufactured deception. There were also, in the days that followed, a small handful of violent incidents, isolated attacks, carried out by extremists on both sides, who refused to accept the peace, believing instead that the revelations were themselves some kind of elaborate deception designed to weaken their side's resolve. But these incidents, however painful, did not derail the broader momentum of the peace. Too many people, on both sides, had lost too much to a war they now understood had never needed to happen. The desire for something better, for a future in which their children would not inherit the same grief they had carried, proved stronger than the pull of old grievances, however deeply rooted those grievances had become, over 100 years of conflict. Aboard the Requiem, preparing for the long journey back to Earth, Elena stood on the bridge one final time, looking down at the golden capital of Kael'mor, a world that had seemed, only weeks earlier, to be the most hostile and dangerous place she could possibly imagine setting foot upon. Now, it felt instead like the place where she had finally found some measure of peace with her own grief, standing alongside a ruler who had lost every bit as much as she had, to the very same lie. "Captain," Reyes said, approaching her quietly as the ship prepared for departure, "we just received word from Earth. They want you back for a full debriefing, obviously, but there's also talk of a formal ceremony, some kind of recognition for what you did here." Elena shook her head slowly. "I don't need a ceremony," she said. "I need this peace to hold. That's the only recognition that matters." "And if it doesn't hold?" Reyes asked, voicing the fear that had haunted the entire crew since the framework's signing. "If the remaining conspirators find some way to unravel everything we've built here." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the golden light of Kael'mor's dying sun catch the ancient towers of its capital one final time before the Requiem began its slow ascent toward the stars. "Then we'll fight for it again," she said finally. "Not with weapons this time, with truth. That's what got us this far, and I believe it's strong enough to carry us the rest of the way, whatever comes next." The Requiem rose slowly into the pale gold sky above Kael'mor, leaving behind a capital forever changed by the truth it had carried across 300 light-years of dark, silent space, and setting course for a homeworld that would need to reckon, in its own time, with exactly what kind of future it wanted to build, from the ashes of a war that had never needed to happen at all. 5 years after the signing of the peace framework, Elena Voss stood once more on the surface of Kael'mor, though the visit this time bore almost no resemblance to her first desperate journey down to the capital. There was no shuttle stripped of weapons, No fear of assassination waiting behind the palace gates. No single case of data crystals carrying the fate of two civilizations. Instead, she arrived aboard a proper diplomatic transport, escorted openly by both human and Kelthari honor guards, greeted at the landing pad by crowds of onlookers, human and Kelthari alike, who had gathered to witness the anniversary ceremony marking half a decade since the war's end. The peace had not been easy, exactly as Zorthak had warned it would not be, on that first strange day when everything had changed. The years since the signing had brought their own share of difficulties. 3 of the 47 Kelthari conspirators had never been captured, believed to have fled into unmapped regions of space beyond either government's reach, and it was widely suspected that remnants of the continuity's old network still operated in the shadows, smaller and more cautious now, but not entirely destroyed. There had been economic disruptions as war industries on both sides scrambled to convert to peacetime production, throwing millions of workers into uncertain unemployment, before new opportunities slowly emerged to replace the old. There had been political upheavals, governments toppled and rebuilt as populations on both sides worked through their anger at institutions that had allowed the deception to continue for so long. And there had been grief, so much grief, grief that did not simply vanish, because its cause had finally been named and understood. Elena herself still thought of her brother often, still felt the particular ache of a loss that could never be undone, no matter how much good eventually grew from the truth that had finally come to light. She had learned, in the years since, that Zorthak's old saying was correct. Grief carried alone remained a stone, but grief shared honestly, between people willing to understand its full weight, could slowly, painfully, become something closer to a bridge. The shared border colonies, the compromise that had nearly broken the negotiations in their third week, had become exactly the kind of quiet success story that Elena had hoped for, though few could have predicted it at the time. The colony of New Threnvos, once a battle-scarred world fought over more times than either side could accurately count, now hosted a joint human Kelthari research institute, dedicated to studying the very technology that had started the war in the first place, working now to find safer, more sustainable ways to harness Ethereum, for the benefit of both civilizations, rather than the profit of a hidden few. Threxa Volcaris, the young soldier who had learned of her brother's manufactured death at a border outpost 5 years earlier, now worked at that very institute, having left military service entirely to pursue the kind of scientific career the war had never allowed her to consider. Counselor Vess had been tried publicly, exactly as Zorthak had promised, in a proceeding broadcast across every world in the Kelthari Empire, and translated for human audiences as well. He had been found guilty on charges that would have been unthinkable to bring against a counselor of his standing only years earlier, and now spent his remaining years in a secure imperial facility, stripped of every title and privilege his 30 years of betrayal had purchased. The former human president, similarly, had faced trial and conviction, becoming one of the most visible symbols of the reckoning that had swept through both civilizations in the years following the truth's revelation. But it was not the trials, or the punishments, or even the careful diplomatic frameworks that Elena thought of most, standing now on the landing pad at Kaelmore, amid a crowd of well-wishers from both species. It was the small, quiet changes that had accumulated across 5 years of peace, changes that would have seemed impossible to imagine during a century of war. Human and Kelthari children now attended shared schools on several of the border worlds, learning each other's languages and histories, not as those of an ancient enemy, but as those of a people who had endured, and eventually overcome, the same terrible deception. Trade routes that had once carried nothing but warships and weapons now carried scientists, engineers, artists, and ordinary travelers, curious to see worlds their grandparents had only ever known as battlefields. Reyes, too, had found his own place in the new peace, though his path had looked quite different from Elena's. He had left the Requiem 2 years after the peace framework signing, taking a position instead as a liaison officer, helping to coordinate the joint tribunals that continued, even now, to track down and prosecute the remaining conspirators, still at large across both territories. It was slow, often frustrating work, chasing down old financial records and hidden accounts scattered across 100 years of careful concealment. But it was work Reyes had come to believe in deeply, understanding that the peace could never be fully secure, so long as pieces of the old conspiracy remained hidden in the shadows. waiting for an opportunity to unravel everything that had been built. Chen had stayed aboard the Requiem longer, eventually rising to the rank of communications officer, aboard what had become, in the years since the peace, one of the most important diplomatic vessels in either government's fleet, ferrying delegates and dignitaries between human and Kelthari worlds on a regular basis. He had married a Kelthari linguist he met during one such diplomatic voyage, a union that would have been almost unthinkable to imagine during the war, and their household had become, in its own small way, a living symbol of exactly the kind of future the peace had made possible. Elena thought of all of them now, standing at the edge of the plaza before the ceremony began, the crew who had waited anxiously above Kaelmore during that first desperate day, uncertain whether their captain would return alive, and who had each, in their own way, gone on to help build something lasting from the fragile peace they had all risked everything to secure. She thought, too, of the ones who had not lived to see this day, crew members lost in the small, scattered conflicts that had flared up even after the formal peace was signed, as remnants of the old conspiracy attempted, unsuccessfully, to reignite the war they had profited from for so long. There had been difficult years, certainly, in the time between the signing and this anniversary. In the second year of the peace, a faction of the remaining continuity operatives, desperate and increasingly reckless, as the joint tribunals closed in around them, had attempted to stage a false flag attack on a human colony near the shared border, hoping to convince both governments that the other side had broken the peace agreement. The attempt had very nearly succeeded, and might have plunged both civilizations back into war entirely, had it not been for the deep, hard-won trust that had already developed between Elena and Zorthak in the months following their first meeting. When evidence of the attack first surfaced, pointing toward apparent Kelthari involvement, it would have been easy, even natural, for the human government to respond with immediate retaliation. Instead, Elena had insisted on direct communication with Zorthak before any response was authorized, a decision that ultimately revealed the attack for what it truly was: one final, desperate gambit by the old conspiracy to undo everything the peace had accomplished. The operatives responsible for that attack had been captured within weeks, tried alongside the other conspirators, and their exposure had, if anything, strengthened the resolve on both sides to see the peace through to something permanent. It was, Elena often reflected, one of the clearest proofs that the framework they had built together was strong enough to survive real tests, not merely the easy, ceremonial moments of anniversaries and formal signings, but the difficult, dangerous moments when old hatreds tried to reassert themselves through violence and deception. Zorthak himself, older now, his crimson robes hanging a little looser on his ancient frame, met Elena at the base of the ceremonial dais that had been constructed for the anniversary, its design deliberately blending human and Kelthari architectural traditions in a way that would have been unthinkable only 5 years before. "Captain Voss," he said, using the old title out of habit, though Elena had long since retired from active military service to take up a permanent diplomatic posting between the two governments. Or should I say, ambassador, now. "Either is fine, Emperor," Elena said, smiling, "though I notice you're not using your own retirement quite as gracefully as I've used mine." Zorthak's 4 eyes crinkled in the expression Elena had learned, over 5 years of friendship, to recognize as Kelthari laughter. "An emperor does not retire," he said. "He simply grows older, while pretending the work grows lighter. But my heir is nearly ready to take the throne herself, and I confess, I look forward to the day I can finally hand this weight to younger shoulders." They walked together up the steps of the dais, past honor guards from both civilizations standing shoulder to shoulder, a sight that would have been unimaginable to either of them on the day the Requiem first appeared above this very capital. Below them, the crowd stretched out across the plaza, human and Kelthari faces mixed together in numbers that continued to surprise Elena, even after 5 years of watching the slow, steady work of reconciliation unfold. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" Zorthak asked quietly, as they reached the top of the dais and looked out over the assembled crowd. "If you had failed that first day, if Vess's soldiers had succeeded, or if I had chosen not to believe you, and ordered my guards to kill you where you stood?" Elena considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I think about all the people who would have kept dying, if the truth had stayed buried. I think about how close it came, more than once, to falling apart entirely. But mostly, I try not to dwell on it. We're here now, that's what matters. A very human philosophy, Zorthak said. Practical, and perhaps a little unwilling to sit with difficult questions longer than necessary. Maybe, Elena said. Or maybe I've just learned that dwelling too long on what might have gone wrong doesn't leave much room for building what comes next. The ceremony that followed was simple, by the standards of Kelthari imperial tradition, though it drew a broadcast audience across both civilizations larger than any event in either species' history. There were speeches, careful and measured, acknowledging both the grief of the past and the cautious hope of the present. There were moments of silence held for the dead on both sides, a full century's worth of names too numerous for any ceremony to fully honor, but honored nonetheless, in the collective grief of two peoples, finally allowed to mourn together, rather than as enemies. And there was, near the ceremony's end, a moment that would be remembered and replayed, across countless broadcasts in the years that followed. Emperor Zorthak Velkalith and Ambassador Elena Voss, standing together at the edge of the dais, each placing a hand upon a newly unveiled memorial, carved from stone quarried on Kaelmore, and metal salvaged from decommissioned warships on both sides. Bearing a single inscription in both human and Kelthari script, a phrase that would become, in the years that followed, something close to a founding principle for the fragile, hard-won peace between two civilizations. The inscription read simply, "Truth, however painful, is the only foundation strong enough to hold a lasting peace." After the ceremony's official portion concluded, Zorthak invited Elena to walk with him through a section of the palace gardens that had been newly planted in the years since the peace, a quiet space where Kelthari flora, dark-leaved and resilient, grew alongside carefully imported human plants, roses and lavender and small fruit trees, that had adapted, against expectation, to the pale gold light of Kaelmore's sun. "My gardeners were skeptical, at first, that anything from your world could survive here," Zorthak said, as they walked slowly along a stone path lined with fragrant lavender. "The soil chemistry, the light spectrum, the length of our seasons, none of it matched what your plants were suited for. And yet, here they are, 5 years later, thriving in soil that was never meant to hold them." "Sounds like more than just a garden," Elena said, smiling. "Perhaps it is not merely a garden," Zorthak agreed. "I confess I had it planted with exactly that intention in mind, a reminder, for myself, as much as for anyone else who walks these paths, that things once thought incompatible can, with patience and care, be made to grow together, after all." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, past a small fountain, where a handful of Kelthari children played, laughing in a language Elena had slowly, over 5 years, come to understand well enough to follow, without needing her translation device. "I received word last week," Zorthak said eventually, "that the tribunal has finally located one of the 3 remaining conspirators, who evaded capture after the initial arrests. He had been hiding for nearly 5 years in one of the unmapped outer colonies, living under a false identity, believing himself beyond the reach of imperial justice." "Will he stand trial?" "He will," Zorthak confirmed, "though I confess, 5 years ago, I might have wanted something harsher for him than a trial. Now, I find I want only the truth of his actions laid bare, fully and publicly, so that the historical record remains complete. Punishment matters less to me now than it once did. What matters is that no piece of this deception remains hidden, waiting to resurface and cause harm to some future generation who might otherwise never learn the full truth of what happened." "That's a very different philosophy than the one I met 5 years ago," Elena observed. "The emperor who nearly had his own soldiers turn against him, rather than believe an enemy captain." Zorthak's 4 eyes crinkled again, in that familiar expression of quiet amusement. "5 years is a long time, Ambassador, even for a being as old as I am. I have learned a great deal, watching this peace grow, however imperfectly, from the wreckage of a war I once believed could never end. I have learned that punishment, however satisfying it might feel in the moment, rarely builds anything lasting. Truth does. Patience does. The willingness to sit with difficult grief long enough to let something new grow from it. That is what has actually held this peace together, more than any tribunal or treaty ever could." They paused near the fountain, watching the Kelthari children continue their game, oblivious to the 2 figures who had, 5 years earlier, changed the course of both their civilizations forever. Do you think it will last? Elena asked quietly. Truly last, I mean. Not just hold together through careful diplomacy and joint tribunals, but actually become something permanent, something the next generation won't need to fight to preserve? Zorthak considered the question for a long moment, watching the children at play. I do not know, he admitted. No one can know that for certain, not after only 5 years, when the war itself lasted 100. But I believe it has a better chance than anything that came before it, precisely because it was not built on the silence and convenient lies that sustained the war for so long. It was built on the hardest, most complete truth either of our civilizations has ever had to face. If that foundation is not strong enough to hold a lasting peace, Ambassador, then I fear nothing ever could be. I choose to believe it's strong enough, Elena said. As do I, Zorthak said. Though I suspect, in the end, that belief alone will not be enough. It will take generations of careful work, careful honesty, and careful willingness to keep choosing this peace, again and again, whenever old grievances threaten to pull us back toward the easier, more familiar path of conflict. But I find, watching these children play here, in gardens that were never meant to hold both human and Kael'thari life together, that I am willing to do that work, for as many years as I have left to give it. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Elena found a quiet moment to step away from the dais, walking alone to the edge of the plaza, where she could look out over the golden towers of Kael'mor, the same view that had greeted her 5 years earlier, when she had stepped off a stripped-down shuttle, alone and uncertain, carrying evidence that might end a century of war, or cost her everything in the attempt. She thought, as she often did in quiet moments like this one, of her brother, 22 years old, dead in a border skirmish that had never needed to happen. She thought of the message that had reached her all those years ago, cold and formal on a datapad, and of the promise she had made to herself in the aftermath of that grief, that if she ever found a way to make sure no one else received a message like that again, she would take it, whatever the cost. She had kept that promise, as much as any single person could ever keep a promise that large. The war had ended, not perfectly, not without cost, and not without grief that would take generations to fully heal. But it had ended, and in its place, something new was slowly being built, something neither human nor Kael'thari civilization had ever truly believed possible during 100 years of fighting. A young girl, no older than 8 or 9, approached Elena hesitantly at the edge of the plaza, her Kael'thari features marking her clearly as a local child, though she wore a small pin on her jacket, depicting both a human and Kael'thari flag intertwined, the kind of symbol that had become common among children born in the years since the peace. "Are you the human captain?" the girl asked, her words rendered through a small translation device clipped to her collar. "The one from the stories? The one who came down from the black ship and stopped the war?" Elena knelt down to meet the girl's eyes, 4 clouded orbs regarding her with the open curiosity of a child who had never known a single day of war in her short life, who had grown up instead, in a world where humans and Kael'thari worked, studied, and lived alongside one another as something closer to neighbors than ancient enemies. "I didn't stop it alone," Elena said gently. "It took a lot of people, on both sides, choosing to believe the truth, even when it was difficult, and choosing peace, even when it would have been easier to keep fighting. But yes, I was there, at the beginning." The girl considered this for a moment, then smiled, a wide, uncomplicated expression that needed no translation at all. "My grandmother says the old war was very sad," she said, "but she also says it's over now, and that we don't have to be sad about it anymore, because we get to build something new instead." "Your grandmother sounds very wise," Elena said. "She says the same thing about you," the girl replied, before scampering off to rejoin her family somewhere in the thinning crowd, leaving Elena alone once more, at the edge of the plaza, watching the golden light of Kael'mor's sun stretch long shadows across a capital that had, against every expectation, either civilization had once held, finally learned to build something better than 100 years of war. High above, invisible against the pale gold sky, the Requiem remained in permanent orbit above Kael'mor, no longer a weapon of war or a desperate gamble for peace, but something closer to a monument now, a quiet reminder of the day the truth had finally arrived, and the century of grief it had, at long last, brought to an end. The war that had lasted 100 years was over, and in its place, slowly, carefully, painfully, something worth calling peace had finally begun to grow.